for a few moments. And now, if anyone wishes, you may come forward and use the microphone, please, so that everybody can hear what you have to say. And I want to encourage people to listen carefully to what is said from up here. These are personal highs and lows that people are sharing with us. So listen to them. So if someone would like to contribute a joy or a sorrow and the rest of us hear it, you may come forward now and do it. And if you choose, you can take a candle and light it to symbolize your particular input. I guess I've had my way of scaring people away again, so.
Well, we all share the same joy this morning, and just to have Craig with us again. We're so grateful that you would take your time on a Sunday morning to be with us. We are always inspired by what you have to say. And our second joy is I think the Zoom is finally working, so the people who are trying to watch from home today can see the service and hear Craig.
For everybody who made the donations for the scarves and the hats, I have a few students, two new students. One student, she's up here, I guess moved to Niagara Falls because of domestic violence issues, but she had 10 children. And I have another student who just moved up here from Florida with 6 children. So all the hats and gloves this week was so cold, the hats and the scarves were gone. So if anybody wants to donate more yarn for Nadja, they are gone. Thank you.
Anyone else with sorrow or a joy they'd like to share? I will light a symbolic final candle to symbolize the unspoken joys and sorrows. And now it's time to take our offering, financial security of this church. I would like to point out to visitors or people that are here for the first time that we're not expecting you to make a contribution.
On this beautiful sunny day, we think of all the people in the world and the struggles that have happened. And as we all know, with the war that's going on, the devastation that we're hearing about all over the world, we are very concerned and hopeful that at some point this is going to stop. Well, today we're privileged to once again hear from Craig Mohkiber. I always have to say, a proud graduate of Niagara Falls High School. I still believe. He's a wonderful speaker. He had a position with the United Nations Human Rights Division, which is a pretty considerable post, I might add. And near the end of that, as he chose to retire, he made a very bold statement about the genocide in Gaza. And I'm sure everybody is aware of that. It just is amazing that all of this has happened. But we'll listen now to Craig. If you would come forward, please. Give us some insight as to what is going on now to try to stop this. Oh, we need to have him. We need to get you hooked up. Oh, you have it?
Yes.
Okay, he has it, okay.
Thank you much. Let me first see if this audio is working. Yeah, sound good in the back? I'll move this one out of the way. So nice to be here again with all of you, so many friends, and always such an honor to be introduced by Marge Gillies, who's been such an important influence on so many young minds in this city over decades and decades and decades, my own included. So thank you, Marge. Always lovely to see everyone here. I have one regret, which is that every time I'm here, I'm speaking about dark matters, and I hope that I can end today's discussion with a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of light on top of what has been quite a devastating more than 100 days now in the Middle East. But I want to bring us back a little bit and say that all of this begins 75 years ago. That was a year that saw both the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we discussed in a previous discussion here at this church, and the adoption of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Both of these instruments adopted because of the horrors that had preceded them, in an effort to try to create a world where never again actually meant something, a world in which atrocities would be prevented, and where they occurred, they would be punished. But that same year was also the year that apartheid was adopted in South Africa. And it was also the year that the Nakba, the first genocidal purging of Palestinians, occurred in the Middle East. So in short, the modern international movement for human rights was actually born into a world of racialized colonial contradictions. It was a world in which the vision that the UN was trying to promote and that international law was trying to promote was challenged from its birth. 75 years later, the world is watching in horror as Israel has continued the Nakba through its 100+ days long systematic ethnic purge of Gaza. And again, with the complicity of Western governments led by our own government in the United States. And we know that the horrors of the original Nakba were met with decades of impunity for Israel, which fed further violence and the spiral of killing that has continued until this day. But this time, 3 decades since the overthrow of apartheid in South Africa, it is the post-apartheid, multiracial South Africa that is taking the lead in challenging this genocidal assault. A few weeks ago, on December 29th, South Africa became the first country to file an application to the UN's highest judicial arm, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, instituting genocide proceedings against the State of Israel for acts adopted, condoned, and taken by the government and military of Israel against the Palestinian people. And in wrenching and horrifying detail, South Africa's 84-page legal document describes a litany of abuses that are, quote, genocidal in character, committed with the requisite specific intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as a part of the broader Palestinian national, racial, and ethnic group. In fact, 2023 was the bloodiest year in the Palestinian territories since the destruction of historic Palestine and the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. In the first half of the year, Israeli assaults on Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza had already reached a fever pitch, with successive waves of mass arrests, settler pogroms, military attacks against Palestinian towns and refugee camps, and the brutal ethnic cleansing of entire Palestinian villages on the West Bank. At the same time, millions of Palestinians were imprisoned by Israel in Gaza, mostly children, mostly refugees, suffering unbearable hardship under the collective punishment of a 17-year-long Israeli-imposed siege that denied them the most basic civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, that denied them adequate food, free movement, medicines, and everything necessary for a dignified existence. Then, as we saw, on October 7th, Gaza-based militants launched a devastating attack on Israeli military and civilian targets and seized more than 200 military and civilian hostages. Since October, Israel then carried out an appalling act of mass collective punishment, immediately cutting off all food, water, medicine, fuel, electricity to 2.3 million Palestinians trapped inside of Gaza, and then began a relentless campaign of annihilation through massive bombing and missile strikes, followed by a ground-level invasion that brought shocking reports of massacres, extrajudicial executions, torture, beatings, mass humiliation, and mass civilian detentions. More than 25,000 civilians have been confirmed killed by the Israelis in that 100 days. The assault has broken all modern records for the pace of civilian deaths. The overwhelming majority, more than 70% of those killed, have been children and women, along with new records for the killing and targeting of journalists and the killing of UN aid workers, including 150 of my former colleagues from the UN killed by the Israelis. Thousands more are still trapped under the rubble, dying from the most excruciating conditions, many others dying from their untreated injuries because every medical facility in Gaza has been targeted and none are functioning in a meaningful way. People are having cesarean sections and amputations without any anesthetic because there isn't any. And now many more are dying from rampant disease caused by Israel's denial of clean water or medical care, even as the military assaults on the Palestinian civilians continue. 85% of all of the people of Gaza have been forced from their homes, and most of those homes have been destroyed. And now, for the first time in history, starvation, externally imposed starvation, is taking hold on the survivors in Gaza. Genocide analysts and human rights lawyers and specialists around the globe, who are no strangers to human cruelty, have been shocked by both the savagery of Israel's acts and by the brazen public declarations of genocidal intent by Israeli leaders. Hundreds of these experts have sounded the genocide alarm in Gaza, noting the point-by-point alignment between Israel's actions and its officially stated intent on the one hand, and the prohibitions that are enumerated in the UN Genocide Convention on the other. So yes, genocide is now beyond doubt. Unlike many aspects of international law, genocide is actually defined with great particularity in international law. It's not a question of editorial opinion. It's not even a moral question in the first instance. It is defined very clearly in that 1948 convention. To qualify it as genocide or attempted genocide, two things are required. First is a specific intent to destroy a particular group, either in whole or in part. And second, with that intent, a number of specified acts that we will talk about. And the petition before the World Court now sets out the case with clear and horrifying and compelling examples. It identifies Israeli actions that match the acts that constitute genocide listed in the convention, including killing members of the group, causing serious physical or mental harm to members of that group, and perhaps most indicative of genocidal purpose, quote, creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. So rarely has there been a case so clear as that we're seeing unfolding in Palestine now. First, these acts are explicitly committed against a specific group, that is, the Palestinians as Palestinians. The enumerated acts of genocide perpetrated against that population are largely beyond dispute. They are broadcast live as they are happening and bragged about by Israeli soldiers in their wake. Think of the large-scale killings. More than 25,000, and we know the numbers are going to be much larger than this, confirmed people exterminated in a matter of weeks. At least 12,000 children. I always have to stop there. 12,000 children, 7,000 women, 6,000 men murdered. Countless whole multi-generational families erased from the public register, annihilated, disappeared. More than 61,000 more have been injured. Many of those will not survive because of the lack of medical care. And many thousands more are still under the rubble, dying slow, excruciating deaths because people can't get to them. Many more are dying of disease and now Israeli-imposed starvation. This horrifying wholesale slaughter of an imprisoned civilian population, whole neighborhoods razed to the ground, massive ordnance, 2,000-pound bombs dropped on densely populated civilian areas, attacks on homes, refugee camps, hospitals, clinics, ambulances, schools, UN facilities, humanitarian facilities, civilian infrastructure, churches, mosques, universities, graveyards, everything that represents the life of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Secondly, the finding of the convention referred to as serious harm, both physical and mental. Well, with tens of thousands wounded, maimed, denied adequate medical care, denied food, water, medicine, shelter, subjected to constant bombing and sniper attacks, widowed, orphaned, exposed to disease, terrorized all day, all night, there's no doubt that these harms have been caused. But then this thing in the convention that's sometimes difficult to prove, that they are deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Here, what genocide scholars have said is that we have a uniquely clear case. Israel has interned 2.3 million civilians in Gaza, most of them poor already, most of them food insecure, most of them already refugees when this began, most of them children. It has imposed a siege on the Gaza Strip since 2005, deliberately restricting the flow of food and water and medicine, and sanitation and construction and free movement, all the elements of decent life, and then periodically launching military attacks against them. But since October, Israel has made that siege total, cutting off all food, fuel, water, and other essentials in another grave breach of international humanitarian law. 2 million women, children, and men have already been forcibly displaced. And Israel has not been shy about the deliberate nature of its unlawful collective punishment on the civilian population, bragging publicly in statements, including from its most senior leaders. They've destroyed homes and schools and hospitals and churches and mosques and courthouses, all food production facilities, bakeries, everything. But most striking of all here is the case of intent. Because normally in genocide cases, the difficult thing is to prove intent. You normally have to dig through dusty government archives to find secret correspondence to prove that what they were trying to do was actually to wipe out the population. Now, the International Court of Justice has said, because it's so hard to prove intent, you can infer intent from conduct. And here, the conduct is 75 years of ethnic purges carried out by Israel, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and now in Gaza. That itself is compelling evidence that what they're trying to do now in Gaza is another ethnic purge. But even beyond that, the climate of impunity that the Israeli government has operated under for decades, underwritten by the government of the United States of America and some other Western powers, has led to a situation which is unprecedented in post-war history. That is, that Israeli officials have been declaring publicly and on the record their genocidal intent because they are sure that they will not be held accountable for these crimes. That's rare in cases of genocide. And here, I'm not talking about peripheral characters or fringe lunatics. I'm talking about the Israeli president, the prime minister, 7 different ministers of the government, senior military leaders, think tanks affiliated with the government, not to mention Israeli media personalities who are openly dehumanizing Palestinians as animals, subhuman, Nazis, terrorists, cancer, ants, vermin. This is language that's very familiar to people who study genocide. And they have openly declared an intent to wipe out all of Gaza, an intention not to distinguish between civilians and combatants, an intention to raze Gaza to the ground, to reduce it to rubble, to bury Palestinians alive, and explicitly to carry out another Nakba, according to the ministers in the government. And the prime minister himself, the most powerful person in the government, has invoked the biblical verse of Amalek, not once, not twice, but 3 times in speaking to soldiers and speaking to the public, a verse that commands that the entire population be wiped out, that none be spared, men, women, children, suckling babies, and livestock, end quote. You cannot have a clearer call to genocide than that. So in other words, what's rare here is that the leadership in Israel have themselves made the case for genocidal intent. And as demonstrated in the World Court earlier this month, these orders were absorbed, repeated, and then carried out by Israeli soldiers on the ground. Now finally, there's the issue of capacity in genocide analysis. Israel has constructed a powerful apparatus of repression, which it is firmly entrenched in all of Palestine and all of Israel. That apparatus includes military occupation and assault forces, abusive police contingents, ruthless intelligence agencies, walls and fences and barbed wire, advanced monitoring and surveillance technologies, drones, autonomous weapons, contingents of violent armed settlers, and a system of repressive laws, including the imposition of apartheid across the land. Through these means, Palestinians are entirely subjugated, forcibly contained, interned, largely defenseless, and they're subject to regular attacks both by Israeli military forces and by violent Israeli settlers. So that means Israel has the means to carry out the genocide, and it is actively deploying all of those means as we speak. Such a case as this, with such a clear and compelling prima facie manifestation of both the acts of genocide and genocidal intent, if legal accountability is not pursued and not secured, then in addition to the intolerable abandonment of the victims themselves, we could see the loss of decades of legal development, decades of efforts to prevent these as the credibility of that international system collapses. Now let me add a final point, since we are speaking today inside the United States of America. The Convention Against Genocide criminalizes not only genocide, but also under its Article 3, complicity in genocide. In this case, we have seen the United States government not only failing in its obligation to prevent genocide, as it did in other genocides, such as those in Rwanda, but here also actively providing economic, military, intelligence, diplomatic cover, all while these actions are taking place in real time, supporting the genocide as it is happening. And official state institutions have even dedicated themselves to disseminating Israeli propaganda for war and genocide, including justifications for war crimes and crimes against humanity delivered across the podiums of official United States government agencies. Indeed, the US has even deployed its veto in the UN Security Council multiple times to prevent a ceasefire. And after every one of those vetoes, thousands more civilians were killed that could have been saved. The US is also actively pressuring UN agencies and actors to be silent on the abuses that are taking place in Gaza. Here too, legal accountability must be pursued. And this culpability will not be overcome by the transparent fig leaf harvesting of some senior US officials talking about trickles of aid delivery or encouraging Israel to kill less civilians in this assault. Legal accountability survives those because the complicity has continued in spite of those statements. Well, the Center for Constitutional Rights here in the United States has initiated against some people in the US government, including the President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, for complicity in genocide under the Genocide Convention. That is encouraging. And of course, the action of Africa in the World Court to hold Israel accountable is also encouraging, that there may finally be some effort at responding to this through the rule of law. But let me add this is a ray of hope. You know, I've written that in a situation is framed by shocking Western complicity on the one side and a massive failure of international institutions, including the UN and the International Criminal Court on the other side. South Africa's initiative at the ICJ is not just important in its own right, but it's important because it is becoming a rallying cry for decent people everywhere to resist what is happening to the civilian population in Gaza. This case comes in the context of extraordinary mobilizations of protest and petitions and sit-ins and occupations and civil disobedience and boycotts and so much more by human rights defenders, led often by Jewish activists in this country and around the world, faith-based organizations, labor unions, broad-based movements across the United States and the world. I was in New York when Jewish Voice for Peace took over Grand Central Station and then the Statue of Liberty, standing up for human rights, standing up for the Palestinian people, and telling Israel that Israel does not act in their name. Stripping away this kind of propaganda effort that tries to draw a line between Jewish brothers and sisters and Muslim brothers and sisters and Christian brothers and sisters and others. That kind of inspiring action has been duplicated and is happening across the country and across the world. This move puts South Africa and potentially the World Court itself on the side of a global mobilization for a ceasefire, for human rights, and for accountability. So one of the most important values of what's happening in the World Court may be its use for strengthening global civil society mobilizations by churches, by ordinary people everywhere, demanding that their governments abide by the obligations imposed on all parties to the Genocide Convention. Now, predictably, Israel has already rejected the legitimacy of the case before the World Court. And confident that the US and its other allies will not allow Israel to be held accountable, the government is defiantly continuing its bloody assault on Gaza, as well as the West Bank. Let us be clear, if Israel and its Western collaborators are once again successful in blocking justice, the first victims will be the Palestinian people themselves. But the very credibility and legitimacy of the international legal order built up since 1945 is also subject to collateral damage. That's why it's so important that South Africa's actions in the World Court has opened up a crack of the 75-year wall of impunity through which a ray of light has begun to shine. And if global protest can seize the moment to turn that crack into a wider portal toward justice, we may just see the beginnings of real accountability for perpetrators, redress for victims, and attention to the long-neglected root causes of settler colonialism, occupation, inequality, and apartheid, and a vision of the Middle East based upon equal rights for Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others for the first time in 75 years. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if you need a microphone for Zoom or if I shall just repeat the questions.
Could you repeat it?
Yeah. So the question is there a timetable for what's happening in the World Court, the case brought by South Africa against Israel for genocide? There are two timetables, because what South Africa has done is two things. One is they have asked for provisional measures. That's like an injunction for immediate action to prevent further harm from taking place. That decision will come in a matter of weeks. And there, what South Africa has asked for is an end to the military assault, an end to the siege in order to allow food and medicine and other things, water and fuel to get in for the Palestinian people, the preservation of evidence, and the opening of Gaza to allow international fact-finding missions in. And that could come, as I say, in a matter of days or within a couple of weeks. And that may be the most important part of this suit. The second piece is likely to take years, which is a final finding of genocide against Israel, together with some recommendations relating to that. But this first piece is really very important because it may be the only hope of saving thousands, if not more, lives at this moment. Now, the problem is this: the World Court does not have its own police force. All states are obliged to comply with the orders of the court. We fully expect that Israel will refuse to comply with any orders of the court with which it disagrees. And what normally happens there is that it's left to the Security Council of the United Nations to enforce the order. There, you can expect the United States will veto the court's order so that Israel will not be held accountable there. That's not the end of it. The case will then move to the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it could do so very rapidly in an emergency special session of the General Assembly that could adopt a resolution calling on states to take certain measures to enforce the judgment. Now, the General Assembly itself doesn't have the enforcement power of the Security Council, but it could adopt a resolution setting out what the obligations of states are in this case. That could include all kinds of sanctions, individual and collective, against Israel to try to pressure it to stop the assault, to hold perpetrators to account, and to provide redress for victims. So for that first piece, we're talking days or weeks. For the second piece, we're talking years.
We have one person on Zoom who has a question.
Hi, it's Desi. Thank you for this talk. I really appreciate. I always love listening to you. But I would like your thoughts on the idea of what Hamas did, and what would the future look like for Palestine if they were to have a just governing system.
Yeah, so on October the 7th, as you know, Hamas forces broke out of the cage that is Gaza. And, they started by waging an attack on Israeli military installations. That's legal under international law. People who are under colonial domination, foreign occupation, have a right to resist, including with armed force. And they had very significant military victories, overcoming with apparent ease the Israeli military installations that were there. However, fighters then continued into civilian areas, apparently looking for hostages to take that they can use to trade for the thousands of Palestinian political prisoners that are held by Israel. That turned into something of a bloodbath that included war crimes committed by Hamas against the civilian population. They, like Israeli perpetrators, should be held accountable under the rule of law for the commission of war crimes, just as Israeli perpetrators should be held accountable for that. That is the vision of the rule of law that says that perpetrators are held to account whoever they are, and victims are given redress whoever they are. And that's the only way that international law makes sense. And that's clearly the case here as well. Palestinians have not had an opportunity to govern themselves in 75 years. Remember that 12 years before I was born, there was a place called Palestine. There was not a place called Israel. Up until that moment, you had Palestinian governing institutions going back for millennia. I was going to say centuries, but in fact for millennia. All of that was destroyed with the creation of the State of Israel. It was an Oslo process that started 30 plus years ago that put in place a kind of interim arrangement on the West Bank and Gaza Strip where there was some limited autonomy, but always under the ultimate control of the occupying power of Israel. So the Palestinians have not had an opportunity at real self-government. They run their local institutions in Gaza, inside the prison that is Gaza, but beyond that, they've never had an opportunity to govern themselves. But even the promise that comes of a two-state solution these days is not something that brings a real hope. And I'll say that for a couple of reasons. One is that there's nothing left for a sustainable, viable Palestinian state. Essentially, all of the land has been occupied, and this Israeli government and no other Israeli government is going to remove the hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers who are on the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. And that leaves, at best, some tiny little areas of territory for Bantustans, such as those that were imposed on Black South Africans under apartheid. That is not sustainable, and that will not end the conflict, and it will not satisfy the rights of the Palestinian people. Neither would that two-state solution solve the underlying issue of apartheid or of inequality. Because what happens to the Palestinians from inside the Green Line of Israel, who will always then be second-class citizens based upon their race? What happens to those who come from those areas and will never have the right to return? Which is why many people have been saying, and I have always agreed, that the answer there is the same answer that we sought for South Africa and for every other situation in the world, which is a single, democratic, secular state with equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, protection for all civilians, truth-telling, as we've insisted in so many other areas. So there are peaceful solutions based upon international human rights that can be pursued and are being pursued by many people on both sides of the Green Line in the Middle East. And there, what we would expect of governance, to answer your question, is exactly that. Democratic governance based upon human rights and the rule of law, in which everyone has 100% equality, whether they're a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or another, across all of the land of historic Palestine and Israel. Yes.
As soon as the United Nations set up the state of Israel, basically, I'm not saying it in elegant words, all of their neighbors vowed to not allow that to happen and took that military action as strongly as they knew how, and have done so since that adoption, correct?
It's not incorrect, but you skipped a few steps.
I probably did.
So first of all, that partition of Palestine by the United Nations was a product of British colonialism that had crafted a deal. Britain occupied all of Palestine after World War I, and then began to compromise the rights of the Palestinian population, the indigenous people, who were more than 95% of all of historic Palestine were Palestinians. And what the British did in that time was they made deals with organizations in Europe, including in the UK, to hand over significant portions of Palestinian land to European settlers to create an Israeli homeland, or a Jewish homeland as it was called in those days. Of course, the Palestinians were opposed to that. They were the vast majority, and they were seeing their own land being handed over to foreigners from Europe. So there was real resistance to that first. In spite of this, the UN, which at that time, remember, didn't include the whole world. It was dominated by Western states, by Europe and the United States, because all of the countries of the South were still under colonial domination, and they didn't have their independence yet, so they weren't member states of the UN. You would have had a different outcome now. So that, rump of the UN then codified what the Brits had agreed with the settlers over the wishes of the indigenous population, and passed a partition resolution that would have given the majority of Palestine to the minority of its residents, which were these European settlers who were there, which again was an act of injustice that the Palestinians, you can't expect them to be thrilled about that. When this happened, you then saw the beginning of the Nakba. This is before any Arab armies got involved, right? 1947 in particular, what you saw was these settlers that would become Israelis, European settlers under the Zionist movement, took up arms and ethnically cleansed village after village, committing massacres like that at Deir Yassin, where they killed 350 men, women, and children, threw their bodies into a well, and then repeated these massacres of Palestinians until the Palestinians fled. After massacre, huge amounts of land being taken over by force, then you saw armies from the surrounding countries begin to respond and launch an attack to try to liberate the Palestinian people. They failed, and Israel then took over even more of the territory as a result of that war, sending, the people in Gaza are refugees from their homes inside what is now Israel, who were purged, ethnically purged in 1948 by that effort. In spite of efforts of Arab regimes to try to rescue them, that effort failed. So yes, there were the engagement of those countries. Those countries subsequently were largely co-opted by various deals. These are not democratic regimes. These are regimes led by people who care about only their own well-being and not very much else. And so that left all of these Palestinians forced out of their homes then, and then sent into the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1948. Those who remained inside were even inside of Israel, were under military rule, not like the other Israelis, for years and years afterwards. And those in the West Bank and Gaza were being administered by Jordan and by Egypt until 1967, when Israel then took over all of the West Bank, all of the Gaza Strip, in addition to the Golan Heights, parts of Egypt, parts of Lebanon, and has maintained its occupation illegally under international law of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights since that time. That occupation has been deeply oppressive, brutal in many respects. It has included the full denial of the human rights of the people in the West Bank and Gaza Strip since that time. And because of its intent to take over 100% of historic Palestine, it has been settling the West Bank and East Jerusalem to the point now where there are hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers illegally in those territories. So, visions of partition, even if they made sense in the first instance, don't make a heck of a lot of sense now, because there's really nothing left for 7 million Palestinians in the remaining territory of the West Bank and Gaza.
I just seem to feel that there's a real dilemma here that you don't acknowledge as strongly as I feel about it, I guess. And that is that the Palestinians did essentially a sneak attack on the country of Israel, I guess, or whatever any way you want to phrase it. And they were simply following what they've been promising to do since Israel was created. All their leaders have committed to this, and it's just hard for me to understand what would be expected of a group of people who are sneak attacked against once they've been told they're going to do this, and they'll continue to do it, and they promise that they will continue to do it. How does that differ from our reaction as a country when we were sneak attacked by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor? I don't understand how we're going to resolve these things. And it's horrible what you've identified as and I really appreciate the way you do it, the horror of any war where people are just literally killing each other purposely. And that's what we somehow got to get around, and I don't know how we do it. What would you have suggested that the Israelis do when they were sneak attack against 2 months ago?
So remember the context, right? This is not the Japanese. This is not somebody coming from another country to attack the United States or to attack Israel. This is the indigenous people of the land who are resisting their occupation by a brutal military force. I mean, that's the context. If you want to do a comparison to the US, it would be Native American tribes that fought back against colonial domination in the United States. That's who the Palestinians are. They are the indigenous people of the land. They were the majority. They've been there for centuries and millennia. They were occupied since 1948, and that occupation has continued and has been brutal. Under international law, they have a right to fight back. They do not have a right to target civilians, but they have a right to fight back, and if you call it a sneak attack, they have a right to sneak attack. They have a right not to announce that they're going to launch a military attack against those who are oppressing them. That's just a question of international law. You can pick sides if you want to, but that's the question of international law. What could Israel have done? I'll answer again as a lawyer. Israel's occupation of the Gaza Strip is illegal. It's illegal. They're violating international law. Even before you get to the cruel acts that are perpetrated in that occupation, it's already illegal. And international law looks at this like the equivalent of a home invasion. If you invade somebody's home and brutalize the people who live there, and then they fight back and you kill them, you cannot claim self-defense because you invaded their home. The remedy under international law is to end the occupation. Because you end the occupation, then the resistance has no justification anymore for fighting back. Now, did Israel have a right to defend itself on October 7th? Absolutely. It could defend itself. It could mobilize its military and its police power, defend its civilians in that place. Does Israel have a right to carry out a wholesale military campaign against the civilian population of Gaza? No, it does not. That is not only a violation of the laws of war, but it is also a violation of the Genocide Convention because of what we discussed here today. Genocide is a very particular crime. It has, I'm going to give you some legalese now. It's a jus cogens crime. It's a peremptory norm of international law. There is no justification. Whatever the other side did to you, you still don't have the right to carry out that act against them. It's also, I'll give you another Latin term, it's erga omnes obligation, which means that the obligation to prevent genocide, to stop genocide, and to publish genocide belongs to all countries in the world. It's an obligation that is universal in this particular crime. So even if you were to say that, look, October 7th was horrible, which it was, it still does not give Israel the right to then carry out mass atrocities against Palestinian civilians. What could they have done? If they had, it reminds me of September 11th. When September 11th occurred, we in my office urged the US authorities to deal with it as a crime against humanity, to mobilize international cooperation to bring the perpetrators to justice. The US refused. It went on a global temper tantrum, resulting in the deaths literally of millions of people who had nothing to do with September 11th, because they chose to just destroy Iraq and huge parts of Afghanistan and to carry out a so-called war on terror, violating the human rights of untold thousands of people, in addition to those who were killed, setting up Guantanamo, denying human rights even of American citizens in those efforts, extraordinary renditions, torture. We remember the response of the US to September 11th. Had they taken our advice, the whole world would have supported the US in bringing the perpetrators to justice, the whole world, and we would have succeeded in doing so. Instead, we created a disaster that led to now decades of unrest and suffering in the Middle East and beyond. So Israel could have done the same thing. If Israel said that, Israel could not have taken action against those who fought their military. They have a right to do that. But they could have taken action against those who targeted civilians, and the whole world would have collaborated in that effort. So they could have defended themselves on that day. They could have brought legal action with the support of the whole international community on the next day. They could end the occupation. They could enter into political negotiations. Israel's declared, so many of the quotes that I gave you here today of what Israel admitted that it's doing, those are in Hebrew to its own people at home. When it speaks to the Western media, it says, we're trying to get Hamas and we're trying to get our hostages back. Well, it's not credible. If you're trying to get your hostages, you wouldn't be dropping bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, where hostages are living. Hostages have already been killed as a result of that. More will suffer from that as well. And if you're trying to get Hamas, you know perfectly well that guerrilla fighters, this is the one lesson of history that the US and everyone else should have learned by now, is that you cannot defeat resistance by killing more and more people. Every child crawling out from under the rubble across the bloodied body of his mother is now a resistance fighter, right? You cannot defeat them, and it's been shown already they have not defeated Hamas. in spite of their superior military and in every respect. So there's a lot that Israel could have done, and they could have done it with the support of the whole world, but they chose not to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Watching this whole thing with Israel, it's obvious that this is just their opportunity to wipe these people out. They just saw the chance. But haven't they been doing this in slow motion for years by pushing the settlers into more and more of their areas, eventually planning to have them have no area at all?
Yeah, this is, Raphael Lemkin, who was the Jewish-Polish jurist who invented the very concept of genocide in the 1930s and 40s. He spoke about genocide as being a part of a continuum. We think of it sometimes as a moment in history when the killing reaches a certain peak. But it is always a part of a continuum. And it's why international law and the World Court has said that you can infer intent from conduct. And why, if you look at what's been happening in Palestine for 75 years, it has been an unbroken series of ethnic purges, clearing first what is inside the Green Line of Israel, whole villages wiped out and then renamed with Israeli names. Then, after the 1960s, doing the same thing in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, and so on. And now we see in Gaza, if you just look at the tactics, they started at the north, and they just carpet bombed, north to south, just destroying everything. And where they reached a part that create problems for them, like a hospital, because hospitals are not only a place that gives hope to the civilian population and care to them, but those, because they are protected under international law, they became places of refuge where thousands of Palestinians were sheltering, even those that didn't need medical care. That created a problem for Israel because visibly that was something that they were struggling with. And so hospitals became a target because they didn't want places of refuge. They wanted to move north to south. And now there's a narrow enclave in the south of Gaza that has not been destroyed, but even that is being bombed, literally as we speak. So it is very clearly an ethnic purge. It's the only explanation of what's happening. And frankly, government officials have been saying it out loud. They want to make conditions unlivable. So any survivors of the genocide, as their conditions are worse and worse and worse, will be compelled to leave through the Rafah border into Egypt and then die slow deaths on the Sinai Peninsula or be accepted into other countries. You even have the Israeli government trying to negotiate with African countries like Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, not exactly hospitable places for any human being these days, to take them. So it very clearly is an ethnic purge, and it's a continuation of an ethnic purge that's been going. That's why I say the only solution that is a humane and a human rights-based solution is to just say everybody's going to have equal rights and give up this idea of ethno-nationalism, which never, ever works.
It hasn't worked at all. Its failure goes long, long ago, right back to the pages of the Bible.
Indeed.
I mean, that was as much a total wipe out of people as you can describe.
Yeah, plenty of genocide in the Bible, plenty of slavery in the Bible, plenty of...
Sponsored by God.
It's sometimes endorsed by God, according to those reports. Yes.
Yeah. That's what the Bible is a report of all those things.
Yeah. I mean, and you think, look, you don't even have to go back that far. Go back to World War II. Go back to the firebombing of Dresden or the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Go back to the wholesale burning of Japanese towns. Go back to the Holocaust. Go back to the treatment of prisoners of war by the Japanese Empire. Go back. I mean, that was global horror. And the whole modern edifice of international law, including the Genocide Convention, including the Geneva Conventions, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, were created because people said we cannot live like this anymore. That was a promise of a different world, and it's all starting to crumble now, because if the West, the most powerful countries in the world, the US, the UK, the European Union, if they say this does not apply, to white people, then it collapses for everybody. The rule of law means the same rules apply to everybody. And we, Palestinians, have the most to lose in this. The Israelis have a lot to lose in this. But everyone in the world has a lot to lose if the legitimacy of international law is destroyed along with all of Gaza. And that's what's happening here because of the complicity of Western states. I think you have one in the back here. Margaret?
My question is, up to a year before, that there was a Hamas fighting. What my baffles me is, if you knew it, why didn't you smother it in the beginning? And hasn't anybody said to people, if you knew about it, why didn't you take care of it back then? Why did you allow it to fester and grow? And then, oh, woe is me.
Yeah. Well,
I don't understand that. I don't understand how the Palestinians knew and Israel knew what was going on, and nobody bothered to do anything about it.
yeah, my theory on that, so what we know is there is a report that the Egyptians warned the Israeli government that this was being cooked up. That's what we know, is that, and that was a year in advance. And the story is that that was largely ignored by the Israelis. I'm not sure it's that clear, to tell you the truth. I mean, the theory there is that, you know, there's somebody who benefits greatly from this kind of a war. Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, who had lost all public support. There were millions of people in the streets of Israel protesting against Netanyahu and his government. He has been indicted on corruption charges. He, you know, as long as he's not in power and leading a war, he is vulnerable to being kicked out of power and then brought to trial and maybe spending a long time in jail. So there's a theory that he benefits from this kind of threat and this kind of a conflict. And indeed, you know, the critique of Netanyahu, except from the families of the hostages, has been tamped down very considerably. The others who benefit from this are the far-right ministers in the government who have been saying openly all along they want to just completely get rid of all the Palestinians so that they can, without any difficulty, control all of historic Palestine and Israel. And this gives them an opportunity to do it, so the Hamas attack gave them a pretext in which they could carry out this dream of theirs of finally purging, ethnically purging all of the land. And all of that is true. But I'm not sure that the Israelis had clear indications of the what, when, where, why, and how. And then just allowed their military to be completely defeated, as it was on October 7th, until they brought in Apache helicopters with fire missiles and just killed everybody, including Israelis, under those Hellfire missiles and tank shells that, in the south of Israel. I'm not sure that they had that clear of a warning of the who, what, when, where, why, and how. It definitely was a surprise attack. All the evidence is there that it was a surprise attack. And even if they had some warning, I don't think that that warning came from the Egyptian government, so it wouldn't have gone just to one source.
You know somebody's doing something. I don't care how good of a person you are keeping a secret, but it's going to leak out.
Exactly.
And it did leak out, and they chose not to do anything about it.
That's a theory. Yeah, that's a theory. I'm not 100% convinced of that theory. I think that there are two explanations. One is that, yes, they wanted it to happen as a pretext. That's a theory. But the other theory is that, while they had some warning, they didn't have the details that, and you know, we know, for example, because Israel was in the midst of carrying out ethnic cleansing on the West Bank, and they had redeployed many of their forces from the Gaza perimeter, outside the cage of Gaza, to the West Bank to support the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And others had been deployed to the northern border. of Israel. So it may have just been a weak moment, but I don't know. Those are two theories, and I think we'll learn more as time goes by.
Thank you, Craig. I did have one follow-up question. Is there anything you would recommend or suggest that any person could do if they were interested about? My daughter went a few weeks ago to the rally in Washington, but is there anything we could do or would you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's entirely up to us. The governments and the international institutions are not going to do what's necessary to take a moral position. I spoke at St. George, some people from St. George. They've been putting together a group to try to bring churches together with Jewish voices. They've been, collaborating with Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, and those sort of things. And they've begun right here in Niagara Falls a conversation between churches, and that everybody is welcome to those conversations. Just because I'm speaking at a church, I think of that. But I think that's where all the hope is. We have seen these massive mobilizations in civil society, as I said, led by principled Jewish activists who have said that they're just not going to allow their name to be abused in this way, and they are speaking out very actively. So I think the answer is solidarity. I think there's a lot of online resources that are available, but right here in Niagara Falls, you can get in touch with the people at St. George, and they'd be more than happy to work together in solidarity on these issues. Also in Buffalo, that link is Western New York wide, and they've been also talking to groups in Buffalo, including Jewish Voice for Peace there. And others. So I think we make the difference in this case. It's speaking out, it's organizing, it's protesting, it's educating, because I'll just say the last thing, I know we have to go. There is a brownout of information in corporate media in the US. No one here will be surprised to hear that ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, these are companies. And those companies are owned by people who have a particular political agenda, and it is reflected in their reporting, which leaves most Americans, if they're not reaching out for independent sources of information, to be not aware. I mean, I've been saying that nobody can claim that they don't know 100 years in that this genocide is being perpetrated in our name. But in fairness, there are people who don't know because they get all their information from the media. So it's up to us, I think, to educate the people around us, and that already can make a huge difference.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the people who have asked questions. I know we have a lot of questions in our minds after hearing this wonderful presentation. We're all concerned. It's got to end somehow. Would you please join me in the chalice extinguishing? It's written in the program. We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. You're all welcome to go downstairs to Unity Hall if you wish. There are some wonderful goodies down there that have been courtesy of the Lisk family, and we can have some additional conversation there. Thank you very much for coming. Have a great day.
I wish you bluebirds in the spring to give your heart a song to sing, and then a kiss. But more than this, I wish you love. And in July, a lemonade to cool you in some leafy glade. I wish you health, and more than wealth, I wish you love. breaking heart, and I agree that you and I could never be. So with my best, my very best, I set you free. I wish you shelter from the storm, a cozy fire to keep you warm. But most of all, when snowflakes fall, I wish you a great big shovel